The story begins on a cold autumn evening in a small rural town in Pennsylvania, the kind of place where neighbors still wave at each other, and the biggest news of the week is a high school football score. It was one of those nights when the wind cut sharp through the trees, scattering brittle leaves across empty roads. Melissa, a 24-year-old nursing student, had just finished her late shift at the clinic. Exhausted, she made the long drive back to her family's farmhouse, headlights cutting through the endless darkness. She pulled into the gravel driveway, shut off the engine, and sat in silence for a moment, enjoying the brief stillness before stepping into the creaking house. That's when her phone rang. At first, she thought nothing of it, just a late-night call. But the number was blocked. She hesitated, a flicker of unease pressing at her gut. Melissa answered. Silence. Not the casual kind of silence that happens when someone forgets to speak, but a heavy, purposeful quiet that filled the line with static and weight. Hello? She asked, her voice sharper than intended. For a moment, she thought the call had dropped, until she heard breathing. Slow, deliberate inhalations, the kind that let you know someone was there, listening, savoring the fact that you couldn't see them. Who is this? Melissa demanded, her voice trembling now. The breathing grew slightly louder, then stopped. The line clicked dead. She stared at her phone, heart pounding, telling herself it was a prank. Yet, something in that breathing didn't feel like a joke. It felt too intentional. She pushed the thought aside and went inside, the farmhouse groaning under the shift of wind. The house smelled faintly of wood smoke and old pine floors, grounding her in familiar comfort. She kicked off her shoes, double-checked that the doors were locked, and curled into the couch with a blanket, trying to calm her nerves. But she couldn't shake the weight of that call. Whoever it was had chosen her number, chosen to breathe instead of speak, chosen to hang up only after making sure she'd heard them. That kind of quiet was worse than words. It was a warning. She left the TV on low as she drifted to sleep, her phone clutched tightly in her hand at 3:07 a.m. The ringing jolted her awake. Same blocked number. Her pulse spiked as she debated whether to answer, but dread outweighed reason, and she pressed the green button with shaking fingers. Again, nothing but breathing. This time it was faster, heavier, like the caller was excited, struggling to contain themselves. Melissa's voice broke as she shouted, "Stop calling me. Who are you?" The line stayed quiet for too long, stretching seconds into something unbearable. Then, finally, a man's voice whispered, ragged and almost playful, "I can see you." The call ended before she could react. She didn't sleep for the rest of the night. Curtains drawn tight, lights left on in every room. She sat with her back against the wall, phone clutched like a lifeline. When morning came, exhaustion blurred the edges of her reality, but her fear remained sharp. Melissa told herself it had to be some cruel prank, maybe someone from town who got hold of her number. But deep down, she felt a gnawing certainty that this wasn't just a random call. Whoever that man was, he knew her, he had seen her, and he wanted her to know it. What Melissa didn't realize yet was that this was only the beginning. Melissa couldn't shake the words from her head. "I can see you." They looped in her mind throughout the day like a curse she couldn't scrub away. She tried to distract herself with chores, folding laundry, and preparing for her next shift, but her hands shook with every task. The farmhouse, usually a source of comfort and quiet, suddenly felt like it had too many corners, too many windows, too many shadows where someone could be standing unseen. She reminded herself that the house sat on nearly 2 acres of land, surrounded by woods, with neighbors spaced far apart. A stranger wouldn't just happen to pass by here. It would mean they came deliberately. That thought alone made her skin crawled. As dusk settled, Melissa double-checked the locks again, shutting the curtains with a nervous urgency. The farmhouse had wide windows that overlooked the yard, and she realized for the first time just how exposed she'd always been. With the curtains open, anyone outside could see straight in, watching her move from room to room. That night, she set her phone to silent, too terrified to answer another call, but she couldn't stop checking the screen. Twice, maybe 3 times, she thought she saw the blocked number flash across it, vanishing before she could be certain. Her nerves frayed, sleep impossible. She began pacing the creaky floors. And that's when she noticed something. From the kitchen window, beyond the glass, beyond the faint glow of the back porch light, a shape seemed to linger by the tree line. She froze, eyes straining. Was it just a trick of the shifting branches? A shadow in the wind? She wanted so desperately to believe that. But then the shape moved. It wasn't sudden. It was slow, deliberate, like whoever it was wanted her to notice. Melissa's breath hitched. She yanked the curtain shut, heart pounding so hard it made her feel sick. She tried to tell herself it was her imagination. That fear was twisting her senses. But a deeper part of her knew it wasn't. Someone was out there. Someone had been watching. Melissa called her best friend, Abby, whispering into the phone as if she might be overheard. Abby tried to calm her, telling her to call the police, but Melissa hesitated. What would she even say? That someone was breathing on the other end of blocked calls? That a figure was standing at the edge of her property in the dark? She knew how it would sound: paranoid, hysterical. The officers in their small town were more used to traffic stops than possible stalkers. Still, Abby's voice gave her strength, and she promised she would drive over the next night so Melissa wouldn't be alone. Melissa clung to that promise like a lifeline, even though the night ahead seemed endless. Later, unable to resist, she peeked through the curtain one last time. The yard looked empty now, the tree line quiet in the moonlight. No figure, no movement. For a moment, she almost convinced herself that she'd imagined everything. But as she turned away from the window, her phone lit up on the table across the room. A new text message. She hadn't heard it buzz because of the silent setting. Heart hammering, she picked it up. The message was short. Just 2 words: nice curtains. The morning after the dream, Megan woke with the uneasy sensation that her room was smaller than it had been before, the walls just a fraction closer. Her porthole window, usually streaked with spray, was perfectly clean, so clean it reflected her face like a mirror. When she looked into it, for the briefest second, she thought she saw someone standing directly behind her. She spun around, but the cabin was empty. Her unease grew heavier by the hour. She couldn't shake the man's words from the previous day. "You're in my cabin." Determined to learn the truth, she sought out Helen in the library. The older woman's knitting needles clicked rapidly as Megan asked if she knew anything about Cabin 743. Helen hesitated before lowering her voice. "There are stories," she said. "A man died in that room. Some say he jumped from the deck. Others say he never left at all." Megan pressed her for details, but Helen only shook her head. "The crew won't talk about it. Not officially. They scrub the passenger lists every year, but sometimes things slip through." She slid a folded piece of paper across the table. "I kept this from a cruise years ago. Same ship. Look at the names." When Megan unfolded the paper, her stomach tightened. It was a photocopy of an old passenger list, dated exactly 3 years prior. Most of the names were blurred from the copy, but one stood out in sharp, bold print: Daniel Crow, Cabin 743. In the column marked "Disembarked," his entry was blank. Megan ran her finger down the list twice, hoping she'd missed it, but there was no departure record. When she looked up, Helen's eyes were glassy. "He never checked out," Helen whispered. "And neither did the girl who had that room before you." That night, as the ship rocked gently on the dark water, an announcement blared over the intercom, the kind that instantly quieted every conversation on board. "Attention all passengers. If anyone has seen Ms. Laura Bennett, please contact guest services immediately." Murmurs swept through the hallways. Megan didn't know the name, but her chest tightened anyway. Later, she overheard 2 crew members whispering near the stairwell. "She was last seen near the aft deck," one said. "Security says the cameras glitched again." The other just muttered, "It's happening again." Before walking off quickly, in the early hours of the morning, Megan awoke to the sensation of the mattress shifting, as if someone had just sat down beside her. She kept her eyes closed, paralyzed, every muscle rigid. A moment later, a cold fingertip brushed her wrist, and a man's voice whispered near her ear, "You need to leave." Melissa and Abby didn't sleep. They sat rigid on the couch until the sun finally rose, every creak of the house making them flinch. When the morning light filtered through the curtains, Melissa couldn't take it anymore. She dialed the police, her voice shaking as she explained the late-night calls, the text messages, and finally, the crawlspace footprint. The dispatcher was polite but skeptical, asking routine questions that made Melissa's story sound exaggerated even to her own ears. Still, they agreed to send an officer out to check the property. Melissa hung up the phone, unsure if she felt better or worse. The stalker hadn't just threatened her anymore. He had stepped into her home. Officer Daniels arrived mid-morning, a tall man with a tired face who looked more accustomed to handling traffic tickets than potential break-ins. He walked the perimeter of the farmhouse, checked the crawlspace, and even examined Melissa's phone. The footprint, by then, looked faint, smudged as if someone had tried brushing it away. Daniels frowned, his skepticism thinly veiled. "You sure this isn't just some prank? Maybe a boyfriend, someone you know trying to scare you?" Melissa bristled, insisting that she didn't have anyone in her life who would do something so cruel. Abby backed her up, but the officer only sighed. "I'll file a report," he said. "But unless you've got proof someone broke in, there's not much else I can do." The words stung, but Melissa clung to Abby's presence as they walked Daniels out. Just as he reached his cruiser, something caught Melissa's attention. A scrap of fabric snagged on the fence at the edge of the property. She pointed it out, and Daniels collected it half-heartedly, tucking it into an evidence bag. "Probably nothing," he muttered. But Melissa couldn't shake the thought that it hadn't been there before. As the cruiser drove away, leaving a trail of dust in the autumn air, Melissa felt the farmhouse swallow her back into its silence. She and Abby looked at each other. Neither of them believed the nightmare was over. That night, they tried to sleep in the same room, both stretched out on the living room couches with the TV flickering softly for comfort. Melissa drifted in and out of uneasy dreams, waking at every sound. Sometime past midnight, a faint tapping noise broke through the quiet. She sat up, straining to listen. Tap, tap, tap. It wasn't coming from outside, it was inside the walls. Abby woke too, her wide eyes confirming she heard it as well. The noise moved slowly, like someone dragging their fingers across the wooden beams of the house. Then it stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the sound itself that Melissa's phone buzzed on the coffee table. She snatched it up, her stomach sinking as she saw the blocked number again. Another text message waited for her. This one was longer than the rest, each word deliberate, taunting. "You shouldn't have told them. I don't like sharing my hiding places." The hours after that chilling text dragged like a slow bleed. Neither Melissa nor Abby dared to sleep, both perched tensely in the living room with every lamp turned on. The farmhouse creaked and sighed with the wind, but every sound felt deliberate now, like footsteps deliberately hidden inside familiar noises. By 2 a.m., Melissa thought she saw a shadow pass under the crack of the living room door, but when she checked, nothing was there. Her nerves frayed to breaking, she whispered, "We need to leave. Tonight. Right now." Abby nodded, relief flashing across her pale face. But when Melissa reached for her car keys on the kitchen counter, she froze. The keys were gone. At first, she thought maybe she had misplaced them in her panic. But as she searched the kitchen drawers, the counters, even the floor, her dread deepened. Melissa never misplaced things, especially not her keys. She turned to Abby, her voice shaking. "They're gone." He was inside. He took them. The reality sank in like ice water. Whoever was tormenting her wasn't just lurking outside anymore. He was moving through her house, leaving his presence like fingerprints on her sanity. Abby grabbed her arm and whispered, "We need to call 911 now." Melissa agreed, fumbling for her phone, but before she could dial, the sound of footsteps echoed upstairs. Slow, heavy, deliberate. They froze, staring up at the ceiling as the weight shifted across the old wooden floorboards. The intruder wasn't sneaking. He wanted them to know he was there. Melissa's hands shook as she dialed 911, whispering their address as quietly as possible. The operator told them to stay on the line and wait for deputies to arrive, but the sound of footsteps moved closer, descending the old staircase one creaking step at a time. Melissa and Abby retreated into the kitchen, clutching each other, hearts pounding so loudly they were sure he could hear them. The footsteps stopped halfway down the stairs. Silence pressed against the house, thicker than the night outside. Then came a noise that shattered Melissa's last shred of control, a low, rasping laugh that echoed through the stairwell. It was human, but wrong, a sound drawn out as though savoring their fear. Abby screamed, and Melissa dropped the phone in shock. The line stayed open, the dispatcher's voice faintly calling their names. Melissa grabbed Abby's hand and bolted for the back door, yanking hard at the lock. It opened, but only to reveal the missing car keys hanging from a single nail on the outside of the doorframe. They hadn't been misplaced. They'd been placed there. Melissa snatched the keys, but before they could escape, something slammed the back door shut from the outside. The force rattled the glass panes, and a shadow loomed over them through the frosted glass. Abby shrieked, pulling Melissa backward. The farmhouse was no longer just a home, it was a cage, and the man who had been watching was finally inside with them. The farmhouse seemed to exhale around them, every board and beam groaning under the weight of silence. Melissa's dropped phone still lay on the kitchen floor, the dispatcher's distant voice repeating their names like an unanswered prayer. Abby bent to grab it, but Melissa yanked her back. The shadow at the door had moved. The man was no longer standing there. He was inside. They didn't know how he'd gotten in. Maybe through the cellar, maybe through the crawl space, maybe he'd been in the house all along. But the certainty of his presence pressed down on them like a hand at the back of the neck. Melissa pulled Abby toward the pantry, an old wooden door just off the kitchen. They squeezed inside, closing it as softly as possible, surrounded by the smell of spices and flour sacks. The darkness was suffocating. Melissa clutched Abby's hand so tightly it hurt. They strained to listen. For a moment, there was nothing. Then came the creak of a floorboard in the kitchen. He was moving slowly, deliberately, as if savoring the hunt. Abby's shallow breathing grew ragged, and Melissa silently pressed her free hand over her friend's mouth, praying they wouldn't be heard. The footsteps circled the kitchen, then stopped. Something scraped against the counter. Metal on wood. Melissa's imagination painted pictures she didn't want. A knife being lifted from the block, fingers dragging along the blade. Then, suddenly, the sound of footsteps crossed toward the pantry. They stopped just outside the door. Melissa's heart thundered so hard she thought it might give them away. The handle jiggled once, softly, then again, harder. Abby whimpered into Melissa's palm. Then silence. Minutes passed like hours, the world holding its breath. Finally, the footsteps retreated, fading into the deeper parts of the house. Melissa wanted to collapse, but instinct screamed that the danger wasn't gone. She carefully cracked the pantry door open, peering into the kitchen. It was empty, but the back door now stood wide open, cold night air spilling in. Had he left? Or was it a trick? The phone lay abandoned on the floor, the dispatcher's voice gone, the line dead. Melissa reached for it, only to stop short. Written in the condensation on the refrigerator door, traced by a finger, were words that hadn't been there minutes before. I like when you hide. Melissa's stomach turned to ice. She shoved the pantry door shut again, bolting it from the inside. She and Abby sat in the dark, both trembling, both knowing one terrible truth. The intruder wasn't just stalking them anymore. He was playing with them. Melissa and Abby remained huddled in the pantry, their bodies aching from the tension of holding so still. Time stretched unnaturally. Minutes felt like hours. Then, faintly, through the howl of the night wind, came a sound that didn't belong, the distant wail of sirens. Relief washed over Melissa so hard it nearly brought her to tears. Abby clutched her arm, whispering, "They're here, thank God." They listened as the crunch of tires rolled over gravel, headlights briefly painting the farmhouse walls. Doors slammed. Voices called out, "Police! Anyone inside?" Melissa burst from the pantry, Abby at her heels. They ran into the kitchen, their voices shaking as they shouted for help. Officer Daniels, the same weary-faced man from the day before, entered first with another deputy close behind, both with flashlights drawn. Melissa felt herself collapse against the counter, finally able to breathe. "He's here. He was in the house," she cried. The officers exchanged a glance, and Daniels raised a hand, steady but skeptical. "Slow down." "Where?" Melissa pointed toward the staircase, her words tumbling over themselves as she described the footsteps, the laughter, the writing on the fridge. The deputies moved cautiously, flashlights sweeping over the old walls, beams catching on every corner and shadow. They searched room by room, floor by floor. The cellar, the bedrooms, even the crawlspace. Nothing. No footprints, no tools, no broken locks or signs of forced entry. The back door, which Melissa swore had been flung open moments before, now stood firmly shut. Even the writing on the fridge was gone, the condensation wiped clean as if it had never been there. Melissa's chest constricted. She knew what she'd seen. Abby backed her up, her voice shaking as she insisted the words had been there. But the deputies only frowned, doubt shadowing their faces. Daniels muttered, "Could have been steam patterns. Sometimes our eyes play tricks when we're scared." But then something broke the tension. The younger deputy, searching upstairs, shouted for Daniels. His voice carried down with urgency. Melissa and Abby followed the officers up the staircase, their hearts pounding with dread. At the end of the hall, in the narrow crawl space, the deputy's flashlight beam revealed something wedged against the far wall. It was an old, dirt-stained blanket spread over a flattened cardboard box like a makeshift bed. Next to it sat empty water bottles, food wrappers, and a small pile of cigarette butts. Melissa's knees nearly gave out. The stalker hadn't just been inside. He'd been living there. Daniels cursed under his breath, stepping back as if even he wasn't prepared for the discovery. Abby gripped Melissa's arm so tightly her nails dug into her skin. The farmhouse didn't just have an intruder, it had been his hideout. He had been there all along, silently moving between the walls and crawl spaces, watching them, listening to them, waiting for the perfect moments to make his presence known. As Melissa stared at the makeshift nest in horror, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out with trembling hands. Another blocked message, arriving even as they stood in the crawl space surrounded by officers. It read, "You brought them into my room." The crawl space discovery changed everything. Even Officer Daniels could no longer dismiss Melissa's fear as hysteria. He ordered a more thorough search of the property, sending the younger deputy around the perimeter while he questioned Melissa and Abby in the living room. But Melissa found little comfort in the presence of law enforcement. The farmhouse still breathed with silence, its every shadow too thick, its every creak too deliberate. Knowing the man had been living above them, listening as they slept, watching through cracks, was worse than any call or text. Her skin prickled with the sense that even now, he might be watching. Daniels assured them he'd have the department patrol the area in the coming nights, and suggested Melissa stay with a friend until things settled. The words sounded reasonable, but Melissa caught herself staring at the farmhouse walls. Every nail, every beam, every hollow pocket of space was proof he could be anywhere. She nodded numbly, but inside she knew the stalker wasn't going to let her walk away so easily. Abby offered to drive her out that very night, but when they checked Melissa's car, the tires were slashed clean through, deep cuts running across the rubber like surgical wounds. Whoever he wasn't just inside the house. He had control over the property. The younger deputy returned from outside, reporting no sign of anyone. The woods were quiet, no footprints visible in the damp soil. Daniels muttered something under his breath and told Melissa to pack a bag while she had the chance. Relieved to finally be leaving, she hurried upstairs with Abby close behind. The house groaned under their footsteps, every corner feeling like a trap. In her bedroom, she threw clothes into a duffel bag, her hands shaking. Abby stood by the window, pulling the curtains shut. Then Abby froze. "Melissa," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Don't come closer." Melissa turned, her stomach dropping. Abby's face was lit faintly by the glow of the window glass. But it wasn't just her reflection staring back. On the other side of the glass, pressed against it as though savoring the view, was the pale, grinning face of a man. His eyes were wide, unblinking, filled with the thrill of being seen. His teeth were bared in a grotesque smile, fogging the glass with his breath. Melissa screamed, dropping the duffel, and Abby stumbled back, nearly tripping over the bed. By the time Daniels and the deputies stormed upstairs, guns drawn, the window was empty. Only a faint smear of condensation remained where his face had been. Daniels barked orders, the younger deputy rushing outside into the night with his flashlight, but Melissa knew it was useless. The man wasn't afraid of the police. He was taunting them. He wanted her to know that no matter how many people stood between them, no matter how many times she tried to escape, he would always be watching. And as if to prove it, Melissa's phone buzzed again in her pocket. A new message glowed on the screen. "Leaving won't help. I'll follow." The farmhouse was chaos after the window sighting. Officer Daniels cursed under his breath. The younger deputy combed the yard with his flashlight, and Melissa and Abby clung to each other, trembling so hard their teeth chattered. Daniels finally ordered them to stay in the living room while he and his partner secured the house. But Melissa couldn't shake the certainty that it was already too late. The stalker wasn't circling the house anymore. He was inside again. She could feel it in the walls, the floorboards, the hollow air that pressed against her lungs. Minutes crawled by in suffocating silence until a sudden crash shattered it. From upstairs, something toppled violently. Furniture slammed, glass broke. The deputy shouted, his boots pounding against the floorboards. Daniels drew his gun, ordering the women to stay put as he bolted up the stairs. Melissa and Abby stood frozen, eyes fixed on the ceiling above as muffled yells and frantic footsteps echoed through the house. Then, silence. A silence too sharp, too sudden. Melissa's stomach twisted. She knew that silence now. It meant the intruder was near. Before they could move, the lights cut out. The farmhouse plunged into darkness, the TV flickering once before dying, leaving only the faint glow of moonlight bleeding through the curtains. Abby gasped, clutching Melissa's arm. From the staircase came a sound that curdled their blood, a dragging noise, heavy and deliberate, like something being pulled across the floor. Then footsteps, slow, measured, descending. Melissa grabbed Abby and bolted for the front door, fumbling with the lock, but the door wouldn't budge. Nailed shut. Her heart pounded as she realized the intruder had prepared for this moment all along. The footsteps reached the bottom step. A figure stood there, half hidden by the shadows. The pale grin they had seen in the window stretched across his face, his eyes reflecting just enough moonlight to burn into their memory. He held something in his hand, not a knife, but Melissa's phone. He raised it slowly, almost proudly, showing the screen. Melissa's breath caught when she saw the image on it. A photo of her, taken as a child, sitting on the very same farmhouse porch. The timestamp was dated 15 years ago. Her legs gave out. This man hadn't just started watching her recently. He had been watching since she was a child. Abby screamed, breaking the moment, and the man lunged forward with terrifying speed. Melissa and Abby scattered in different directions, furniture toppling as the intruder's footsteps thundered after them. The farmhouse erupted into chaos, shouts, crashes, the sound of a struggle in the dark. Melissa barely managed to grab a heavy lamp and swing it wildly, hearing it connect with a sickening crack. The intruder stumbled but didn't fall. His laugh, low, rasping, and broken, filled the darkness again. He wasn't hunting anymore. He was claiming. The farmhouse descended into chaos. Melissa stumbled through the dark, her lungs burning as she screamed Abby's name. Furniture crashed behind her as the intruder charged, his footsteps pounding closer. In the moonlight, she caught glimpses of him. Broad shoulders, pale face, that grin twisted with obsession. He wasn't hiding anymore. He was reveling in the chase, moving through the house like it already belonged to him. Melissa darted into the kitchen, her trembling hands groping for anything to use as a weapon. Her fingers closed around a butcher knife from the counter just as the man's shadow stretched across the doorway. Abby screamed upstairs, the sound cutting through the dark like a blade. Melissa's heart lurched. He had gone after her. Knife clutched in her hand. She bolted up the staircase, every step threatening to give way beneath her weight. At the top, she found Abby struggling against him, his hands gripping her wrists as he shoved her toward the crawlspace door. His grin widened when he saw Melissa, as though this was the moment he'd been waiting for. "You don't understand," he rasped, his voice low and broken. "I've always been here, always watching." His words weren't shouted. They were whispered, as if he was sharing an intimate secret. Melissa's rage overpowered her fear. She charged, slashing wildly with the knife. The blade grazed his arm, and he howled, shoving Abby aside. The three of them tumbled against the walls, the old farmhouse groaning under the struggle. The intruder fought with the strength of obsession, grabbing Melissa's wrist and forcing the knife toward her own throat. His eyes burned inches from hers, that grin never faltering. But then Abby, shaking and desperate, grabbed the heavy flashlight the deputy had dropped earlier and swung it with all her strength. The metal cracked against his skull. He staggered, releasing Melissa, and collapsed half into the crawlspace, blood streaking down his pale face. Sirens wailed again outside. Backup had arrived at last. Deputies stormed the house within seconds, flashlights blazing across the carnage. The intruder tried to crawl deeper into the crawlspace, but Melissa, shaking with adrenaline, hurled the knife aside and slammed the door shut, her whole body pressed against it. Officers dragged her and Abby away as others pulled the man from his hiding place. For the first time, Melissa saw him clearly in the light. A gaunt, middle-aged man with sallow skin and wild eyes. He wasn't a stranger. He had once worked as a handyman for her parents when she was a child. He had been in the house before, learning its structure, its secrets. And he had never left, as the deputies dragged him out in handcuffs, his bloody grin fixed on Melissa. "You'll never get rid of me," he hissed, his voice hoarse but steady. "I'll always see you." Melissa's body shook as the words lodged in her mind like thorns. But for the first time in days, the farmhouse felt lighter, as though a suffocating presence had finally lifted. Abby wrapped an arm around her, guiding her outside into the crisp morning air. The sun was rising over the trees, painting the world in fragile gold. The nightmare was over, or so she told herself. But even weeks later, long after the man was locked away, Melissa would still wake in the dead of night, certain she could hear his voice whispering from the walls. "I can see you.